Okay, here we are once again. Nothing new here. Exam is on Monday. That's, 4 days from now. Same old news that we had every time. Nothing different here. But again, to remind you, it's in the evening on Monday. It takes a while to get there. Check on Google Maps. You can look up Black Rock Exam Center. That will get you to the building. It's a giant warehouse of a building. It's like where they keep the space shuttle. It has its own weather and all of that. It's unfortunate. Those of you who have various from the accessibility office, various issues, and need a separate room, we have separate rooms over there. So come to the exam center, and then we'll bring you to the place. Okay. So questions about the exam? Questions about the material on the exam? I know several of you came up to me just before class and I shot you down saying, come to say it in class. So now's your shot.
20.2 midterm.
22. Let me find it here. Let me first of all get you. Is that gonna work? Always a mystery. Always a mystery. Yes. Okay, so let's see. 2022 midterm. Second to the last one. Thank you. And what are we looking at here? Question 12. Okay. So we didn't specifically talk about this. We touched on it really briefly. We didn't spend lots of time on it this year, but just so you can see the situation, what's happening here, we don't have, there's a new computer model introduced, replacing an existing model, right? And this happens all the time, right? In technology, we get something new, we have to update it. We used to have horse and buggies, we had to substitute cars in there for that, and so on. The price of the new model is higher, but it's better, right? So what does this mean? Well, we're putting in something that has a higher price, so it will make it look like the prices went up. On the other hand, it's a better thing, right? And so we're substituting away from the worst thing towards the better thing. And we're asked to, so this is going to overstate inflation, right? Because it's going to say that there's a 5% increase in prices, but actually you're getting something better. So if we were buying something better before, it would have cost us more, but we didn't. Right? And so it's going to look like inflation is higher than it really is. Or, I don't know, it is what it is, right? It'll make it look like it's higher than what we think in CPI means, like when we didn't take a class, right? But we think it measures the cost of living, but it's not quite that, right? And this is one of the ways that it's not quite that. So it's going to overstate inflation because of substitution. The substitution effects, that's C. But again, we had this, but we had it so briefly that I wouldn't ask a question like this on the exam. Okay. Other questions? Okay, if they come to you during our class today, just stop me. Exam is high priority. What I'm talking about today, high priority in the bigger picture of life, but not for Monday, right? And so, like, if anything comes to your mind that I wish I knew this, please stop me. But I'm just going to continue with new material if you don't stop me. So the more questions people ask, the happier everyone is, actually. Yes?
We should become revision on our long-term exam.
Do we need revision from last year's exam? Last term?
The thing on above 3 ones.
So this one, the 2022 one. I'm going to move a mouse and you can tell me when I get near. Warmer and colder. I'm going up. Is this?
Yeah, the up one, 3.
This one here?
Oh, 3.
What's 3?
Above 3.
Oh, week 3. say up or down.
Yeah, this first three parts of the exam.
So I'm not sure I understand the question.
You really need to take our revision on our final exam.
Oh, from the final exams that are here. So the situations, I put just all the old exams. My general feeling is if I had my way, I wouldn't put any exams up there. And then, but the fact of the matter is some people have old exams and other people don't, and that's unfair. My main job is to make sure that the exams are fair, right? So I put it up for everybody.
Revision on midterm exam.
No. Let me finish. So they're all the old exams, but in the past, up till now, we've covered all the same material. The old classes covered more material than we did because we're moving to theory quicker than them. So we're going to cover more material overall in the course than they did. But so far, we've covered less than they normally have at the midterm in the sense of GDP and stuff. They spent much more time on GDP accounting stuff, which means, though, that we have gotten farther in the material than they did. So there's some stuff that's on the final exam, on the old final exams, that they hadn't gotten to at this point in the course, which means some of the stuff, and in particular, the Keynesian cross diagram, right, and the multiplier, that stuff you'll find on the final exams. You won't find it on most of the old midterms because they just hadn't gotten there yet, right? And so you do need to look at the old final exams as well. But there are going to be lots of stuff on the old final exams that is totally irrelevant for you yet and will be relevant as we go forward. Was that did I say too many words to make a simple idea? You need to look on the final exams for the Keynesian cross diagram. There, that's hit the small, yes, you do. You need to look at it, okay, but not for everything. Yes, yeah, but not everything on them, just Keynesian cross diagram. And also some of the questions covered earlier material too on the final exams, right? Because always the final exam is cumulative, everything in the semester, but it emphasizes new stuff. So some of it will go back to CPI and all that stuff on the final exams. So there are questions on the final exams that are relevant to you at the moment. You're looking at me like I totally complicated an easy idea. That's correct. I did totally complicate an easy idea. You need to look at the final exam, but everything on the final exam is not necessarily relevant, is not relevant, right? Some of it is, some of it isn't. Other questions about the exam? Right. If anything comes to you in the class, just let me know. We will stop and go back to it because that is back over here. Worked remarkably well. And of course, you're aware, if we can get back there, we have the drop-in center open today. You can also email that email and you may get an answer in time for the exam. You may not, right? Because it's getting pretty close to the exam. Okay. Here, go to page 18. Okay, so this is where we were. Now we talked about bank runs, right? That any modern bank, except for Horace Bank, if everyone wants their money out at the same time, the bank simply doesn't have it. Right? They've only kept part of their money in reserves, a fraction of the money that you deposit gets kept in reserve, and the rest gets loaned out to people, and that's where banks make their profit. Right? Or, you know, any income that they might make is coming from loaning that money out. Okay. So it used to be back in the ancient days that bank runs happened all the time and they were a major crisis for people. Nowadays, for most of us that have less than a couple €100,000 in the bank, if the bank goes under, it's not a major crisis. And that's due to this deposit insurance. Okay, so now we want to talk about the money market, and we're going to, where we're going with this is looking at how the central bank controls the money supply, how they can increase the money supply, how they can decrease the money supply, and how that affects interest rates. So that's the point of this. So our first thing is, it's economic. So you know there's going to be supply and demand, there's going to be a line up, there's going to be a line down, there's going to be a magic point where they cross, because that's how economics mostly works. And so the first step is the demand for money. And this strikes people weirder than the demand for, say, shoes. When we say demand for shoes, everyone's on board with demand for shoes. When I say demand for money, people get, what? Well, I just want lots of money. Like, of course I want more money. But of course we want more shoes. Okay, maybe not all of us, but lots of people want more shoes than they can afford. And the reason they don't get all the shoes they want, like Imelda Marcos, is that other parts of their life would have to be constrained, right? They have a budget constraint. Therefore, 10 pairs of shoes is enough. They don't have anywhere to store it. They'd have to buy a bigger closet. It's all, and they'd rather eat. And so they don't have all the shoes that they want, right? And we're fine with that. It's going to be very similar with money. We want lots of money, but in fact, we have to give up something to get it. And so we're going to balance off the cost and benefit of holding our wealth in terms of money. Okay. So the idea here is that we have a certain amount of wealth, right? And we can put this wealth into various things. We can put it into comic books, we can put it into stocks, we can put it into bonds, and we can put it into money. And so we're thinking about money as this sort of M1 definition of money, right? That is bank account balances and cash. So very liquid assets, things that are really easy to spend. And the thing about money, the way we've defined it, particularly the medium of exchange function of money is anything that makes it easy to buy stuff, that solves this problem of double coincidence of wants. So we're looking for, if we're holding our wealth in terms of money, we're doing it because we want liquidity. We want this ability to buy stuff. Maybe we're going to buy stuff, maybe not, but we at least want the option to be able to buy stuff easily. Right? And that's the advantage of having our wealth in terms of money. On the other hand, if we hold our wealth in something else, it's probably going to have a higher return. It's probably going to be a better store of value because we've organized things to emphasize the medium of exchange function of money. Right? And so if we say put our wealth into stocks or bonds or real estate or something else, we're going to get a return on that investment. We shouldn't call it investment, right? We've redefined the word investment. We're going to get a return on that that we won't get if we hold our wealth in terms of something very liquid like cash or checking account funds. So we are going to be, just like when we're buying shoes, we're constrained by our budget. Here we're constrained by the amount of wealth we have, and we might not decide to put all of our wealth into money. We might not decide to put all of our income into shoes in exactly the same way. We're comparing the benefit of having more shoes versus what we have to give up in our life when we get more shoes. Here, with money, we're having the benefit of having this liquid asset, something that we can spend easy, compared to the cost because we're giving up something to get it. We're giving up the interest return that we could get if we held our wealth in other assets. Okay. And so to start this out, let me assume that money carries zero interest rate, just to make an easy story here. And that seems natural. Like if you have euros, you're not going to get any interest on those euros. I will say that if we go back to our history of money lecture, there was a time when banknotes would pay interest. That is, they would print on the note that the bank issued. If you bring it in by this date, you're going to get 1 ounce of gold. If you bring it in by some later date, you're going to get 1.1 ounces of gold, and so on. And it would print it right on the banknote, and banknotes would actually pay interest. Okay, we don't have that in our current euros, right? Euros just say euro, so if you hold it for a year, you still have the same number of euros, so it pays zero interest. But remember, we've decided to define money to include bank account balances, right? And when I say money, you are supposed to be thinking, it's almost entirely bank account balances. So you're really supposed to be thinking checking account balances. You're not supposed to be thinking in terms of these notes and coins, because that's a very small portion of the money that's out there when we include the bank account balances. So for that, this zero interest assumption is less obvious. I know for you and me, we don't get paid interest on our checking accounts, right? We actually have to pay them for the privilege of them holding our money. But if we were a larger customer like IBM, right, then they have payroll of 50 million. And so then they start having negotiating power with the bank. And larger businesses will get an interest return on their checking account. Right? So this really is an assumption just for simplicity here. In real life, holding your wealth in terms of money for larger customers does not mean zero interest rates. But what we need here is not that it's a larger interest, that it's no interest, but that it's smaller than other things that you could do with your wealth. Okay, but for simplicity, let's suppose that it has zero interest, like it does for you and me. So here we have multiple choice coming to you on Monday, so we'll get a few multiple choice questions up here for today. If there's inflation then, and money doesn't pay any interest, which doesn't it do very well? People thought their thought. I won't put anyone on the spot for this, but medium of exchange works just fine, assuming the inflation isn't too high. But it's a bad store of value. And it's also not a great unit of account because it's harder to compare prices today with prices last week, right? But it's clearly a bad store of value. And this is like the answer I would expect on a multiple choice exam. I would expect B, but I could be talked into C, right? Because that's also true. So it doesn't serve very well as a store of value if there's inflation because I have 100 euros today. If I hold it for a year, I still have 100 euros, but it can buy less stuff than it did before. So the real return is negative if there's inflation. Okay. But we've emphasized the medium of exchange function of money, and this is how money works for us in real life these days. This is also true for big companies that have bank accounts. They'll get some interest rate on their bank account, but they won't get as high as they could doing something else, like buying stocks or bonds or something. And it usually won't keep up with inflation either. Okay. So really all we need is that very liquid assets like money give you less return than less liquid assets like stock, bonds, buying a factory, other things you could do with your wealth. Okay. So we're going to talk about like a few things that matter for how much wealth you decide to hold in terms of money. Right? Clearly, the amount of wealth you've got matters for that. If you have lots of wealth, you're going to hold lots of wealth in terms of money. And if you have very little wealth, if you have no wealth, you're not going to have any money at all, right? But aside from that, the nominal interest rate is going to be important. And this is what we're going to think of as the price of money, right? Because if I decide to hold my wealth in terms of money, I get no return on my holdings, right? I still at the end of the year, I have 100 euros. If I decide to do something else, loan it to somebody, say I buy a bond, I'm loaning it to somebody, then I get an interest return, say it's 10%. Right? So what I'm giving up by holding my wealth in liquid assets in terms of money is that 10% that I could have gotten if I had used my wealth to loan it to somebody. So that's going to be our price of money. The higher the nominal interest rate is, the more I'm giving up by holding my wealth in terms of money. Just like the higher the price of shoes are, the more I'm giving up to buy a pair of shoes. Right? This is what I'm foregoing when I decide to buy this thing, to use this thing. Okay. And so we got a price, we got a quantity, we can very naturally draw a demand curve. Here it is, money demand. This is the amount of money we as a society want to hold, and this is the nominal interest rate, our little I. When the nominal interest rate is very low, say it's 0, then I have a choice between holding my wealth in a bond, right, in which case I get 0 return, and I can't spend it very easily. Or I could keep my wealth in terms of money, something very liquid, just in a bank account, and I can spend it very easily and I get the same return. So I might as well hold all my wealth in terms of the liquid asset, right? In terms and put it just in the bank. There's no point buying a bond that pays the same return as what I get in the bank. right? So I hold lots and lots of money. On the other hand, when the interest rate goes up, just for whatever reason, we don't know why it would go up, but suppose it went up. Suppose the interest rate was way up here, say 10%. Then when I hold my wealth, I have the same wealth, but if I decide to hold it in terms of money, I get no return. But if I decide instead of having money that I loan it to somebody, I buy a bond, in that case, I'm getting 10% return. So the higher the return is, the more of my assets I'm willing to hold in terms of bonds and the less in terms of money. It means I'm less liquid, I'm less able to react to changes. I can't on a whim go to the Bahamas, but I'm getting a return on my assets. Right? So the higher the interest rate, and so we can think of this just as the price of money. And we will from now on just think of the nominal interest rate as the price of money. It works just like a price. It's what I'm giving up in order to hold my wealth in terms of money. Other thing that, before I talk about that. Now, when we draw these graphs, and this is not just true of this graph, but of pretty much every graph that we do in economics and elsewhere, what we're doing is we're saying, well, real life is complicated. We know that. And we're making this very simplified model of the world. Right? And in particular, we're making it so simple that I can draw it on a two-dimensional plane here, this back board here, the wall, is two-dimensional, right? So I can only really put two things on there by the limitations of my technology, my 2D technology, and all the expanse and whatnot. They got the 3D projections and stuff, but we don't got that. Well, all we have is 2 dimensions to work with. So I can only put 2 things on my graph, right? And one thing I put, because I wonder how much money people want to hold. So that's one of my dimensions, because that's what I'm curious about. And then the other thing, I can pick one of the millions of things that affect how much money people want to hold. I can put on the other dimension. Okay? So what I'm implicitly doing is I'm saying all those other things, let's just hold them constant and just change the interest rate, leaving all those other things that matter for how much money people want to hold. I'm going to leave them constant. Okay? And then I can draw out this graph. But if any of those other things change, this graph is going to shift. Ideally, for example, the first one we're going to have is income, right? People who are spending a lot need a lot of money. Why? Because money is the thing that makes buying stuff easy. That's how we defined it, right? It's the thing that makes transactions easy. It's our medium of exchange. And so if I'm buying loads of stuff, I'm going to need a lot of medium of exchanges because I got a lot of exchanges to do, right? So if I have high income, we said I'm going to have high consumption. If I have a high income, I'm going to hold more money. Okay. That's going to be the next slide. But if we do that, if we say that, well, we're not going to be just moving along this curve because this curve was drawn keeping everything else that matters constant. So it was keeping our level of income the same, and then we change the interest rate. So if level of income changes, we're going to have to shift this curve. Now, in an ideal world, we'd have one of those expanse computers that was in 3D, and we'd have a dimension coming out sort of perpendicular to the wall, and that would be wealth. And then we'd have all of those things in sort of like a big bowl-shaped thing in a 3-dimensional graph. I'd draw it, but you know I can't manage it, right? You've seen me draw, right? You know it's beyond my abilities. But you can imagine that it was a 3D graph, and it was showing as we go out from the board, people get richer and richer, right? Higher and higher income, and they'd have a different curve for each one of those, okay? So what we're really doing is saying, let's just look at one particular income. Let's take a slice of that 3D graph, and this is what the slice looks like. But if we sliced it at a different income, we would have a different curve, right? So what that means for us is that if income changes, this curve is going to shift. It's not really shifting. We're just looking at a different slice of it. But from our point of view, we've drawn this keeping income constant. If we change it, it's going to look like the curve is shifting. So we're going to think that if real income changes, in particular, if real income goes up, if people become richer, they're going to make more purchases. Therefore, they're going to need more of the stuff that makes purchases easy. And that's money by definition. Right? And so if people get richer, if Y goes up, the amount of money that people want to hold is going to go up. So at any particular level of income, any particular interest rate, before, when they had low income, this is how much money they wanted to hold. And now that they have more income, they're going to want to hold more at the same interest rate. So we're going to shift the whole curve to the right. That is, at any particular interest rate, any particular price of money, now that people have higher income, they're going to want to hold more money than they did before. And likewise, if they get poorer, if income goes down, the whole curve is going to shift to the left. People with me here? Okay. Now there's millions and millions of things that affect how much money we want to hold, right? How many purchases do we want to make? Well, it depends on the advertisers. Have they gotten to us or not, right? It depends on loads and loads of things, what's going on in our life and all that stuff. But the two that we're going to pay attention to in this class are the wealth, Y, not wealth, but Y, and income, and the price level. And we haven't talked a lot about the price level, but where we're going with this is we're going to start talking about where inflation comes from and how inflation affects the economy and stuff like that. So we want to bring in the price level here. So if things become more expensive, well, it takes more money to buy the same stuff. Right? We want to buy some stuff. Now it's more expensive. We need to have more money in order to do that because money is what makes purchases easy. We need more in our checking account balance, right? So if prices go up, we're going to demand more money, right? We're sacrificing. We're taking it out of our interest-bearing assets, but what can you do? Right? So you can imagine, for example, I'll go back to IBM here. IBM, the prices went up, and that in particular means prices of everything, including the prices of workers. The wages of workers went up. Right? So now, in order to make payroll, they have to have more money in their bank account. And so they can't put as much of their wealth in interest-bearing assets. They have to hold more of it in terms of just bank account balances so they can pay people at the end of the month because people's paychecks are now higher. It's one of the prices in the economy. And so the graph is going to look exactly the same. The original graph was done for a particular price level, and then we just changed the interest rate, said high interest rates at that price level, here's how much people want to hold. Lower interest rates at that same price level, they want to hold more. But now at this, particular interest rate, if I can get it out there, at that particular interest rate, before they wanted to hold this much money. But now at that same interest rate, now that prices have gone up, if they want to buy something, it's going to cost them more money, so they're going to need to hold more money in order to buy it. If price of pizza goes up and you're thinking maybe I'm going to get pizza on the weekend, well, you need more money in order to do that, and so you're going to hold more money. Okay? And so that at that price, at that interest rate, the amount of money that we want to hold goes up. Okay? Now again, we haven't said what interest rate is going to be there. This is true for each and every interest rate. At any particular interest rate, when prices go up, people are going to want to hold more money than before. Okay? Maybe not as much as the prices went up. We don't know that, but we know they're going to want to hold more. Okay. So that's money demand. It's just like the demand for shoes, for those of you who took microeconomics. Exactly the same thing going on. We're graphing one thing. We're graphing the amount that you want against the price. In this case, the price is the nominal interest rate, what you're giving up in order to get your wealth into this liquid asset. So you're giving up, putting it into bonds or stocks or something like that in order to have it in your bank. Right? I know most of us don't think that way, but this is for larger customers, this is the deal. Right? Okay. And then there's lots of other things that affect how much you want. And if any of those other things change, this curve is going to shift. There's millions of these things, but the two that we're going to be really concerned about are real income and the price level. But there's other things as well, right? It's how easy can you switch assets from, how easily can you switch your assets from being in bonds over to being in your bank account, right? Back in the old days, when I was young, we were going to, anyway, when I was young, you'd have to go physically to your stockbroker and do a whole thing, and it could take you a week to get, right? Nowadays, you can do it on the app. 5 hours later, you're going to have your wealth in your bank account. And so now you're less inclined to hold your wealth in terms of money. You're more inclined to hold it in terms of these interest-bearing assets. Right? But still, the trade-off is there. Right? So these things change over time. These things depend on the society. These things depend on many, many, many more variables that we haven't put in here. Any one of those variables, if it changes, it's going to shift this curve. But the two shifts that we're particularly interested in this class, real income and the price level. Because those are things that we're going to be purporting to try to explain in our stories. Right? Okay. Now we got the money supply. We got money demand. That's a downward sloping line. Looks just like like shoe demand did. It's not any different, other than it feels weird. But other than that, it's exactly the same thing. But we're also going to have a money supply, right? Line going up, line going down, magic point where they cross. That's how economics works. We got the line going down, so we're halfway there. Now we need the line going up, our money supply. Okay. And to do this, let's start out by supposing that all of the money supply is in the bank, right? It's all bank account balances. Everyone holds all of their liquid assets in the bank account. Nobody holds any cash. Just complicates things to have cash. Let's pretend like cash doesn't exist. Right? We'll come back to it. But right. And so from an individual's bank's point of view, people have deposited a bunch of money in my bank, a bunch of wealth in my bank. So let's say I have 100 million in the bank, and I'm going to keep some of it in reserve, and I'm going to loan the rest out. Right? So I'm going to keep, say, realistic numbers. I'm going to keep 95%. I'm going to keep 5% in reserve, and I'm going to loan out 95% of that. Okay? And that's where I'm going to get my profits on the interest that people pay me as I loan that out. Okay? So from their point of view, what they've got for this 100 million that's been deposited, they have 5 million that's sitting in the vault. They have 95 million that people owe them but hasn't been paid back yet. And they owe us 100 million. Right? Anytime we want, we can get our money back. Right? So it all balances out. Right? Right, so we've already talked about bank reserves. And so a bank, like if you were just operating a bank, and we're going to forget the government for a moment. Right? Government is very important in banking. But pretend like there was no government. So we're going back into the 1800s here, early 20th century. Very little government involvement in banks. You just set up a bank just like I set up the Bank of Ivan down here. If people trust you enough, they start depositing their money in there. And then you start loaning it out. And this is how banks worked back in the day. Okay? Now, if you were a bank running like this, you would have a certain amount of deposits that you would want to hold in reserve. That would be totally up to you. You could keep a large amount in reserves and be a very safe bank, but not make very much money. Or you could hold very little in reserves, loan out a lot, make loads of money, but be a risky bank. Right? That, like if you loan out enough, if anyone even asks for any money back, you don't have it. Right? And so the more you loan out, the less you have if people want their money back. And they would be, some banks, some bank managers, some bank owners would be very prudent and risk averse. Some would be, I don't care, like it's just a gamble, and I keep all the winnings, and if everyone goes under, that's too bad for them. And so some people would be riskier, some people would be less risky. But each bank would have a desired reserve ratio that they were going for. They'd say 3%. I want to keep 3% in reserves. That's what I desire. I don't want to be riskier than that, even though it gives me more profit. It's not worth it. I'm giving up. If I go under, I don't get profit next year. Right? So I balance it off. I have a desired reserve ratio. And this, by the way, would change over time. Right? This desired reserve ratio, it would not be constant. If I'm a bank that mostly serves agricultural customers, for instance, I'm going to be thinking that in planting time, when people need to buy seed, they're going to be coming to their bank and getting a lot of their money out. So I'll try to keep a lot in reserve because I'm expecting people to be withdrawing their cash. Right? But if it's if it's just after After harvest, everyone's putting money in the bank. I'm not really worried about people withdrawing money so much. I would have very small amounts of money in reserve. My desired reserve ratio would change depending on what I saw as the risks of people taking their money out. In modern banks, this desired reserve ratio changes day by day throughout the week. They have like so much gets taken out on weekends, so much gets taken out in this holiday and that holiday. This time Easter is falling in conjunction with, like they have whole models for this, and they decide how risky they want to be based on how much that they think people are going to be taking out. Reasonably good most of the time at predicting that. They're bad at predicting it when things are unusual, as you would expect. When things are going normally, they're pretty good at it. When things go haywire, they don't know what they're doing. Okay, so suppose that's going on. Suppose that's going on in the background. And I want to increase, I didn't get it here, but yeah, I'll come back to it. No, let me do it now. It's the time. Okay. In real life nowadays, we have deposit insurance. It's not the 1800s banking system anymore, right? Nowadays, like after the Great Depression, countries all over the world imposed deposit insurance. And what they're doing there is they're saying, I am going to guarantee this bank, right? If this bank goes under, I'm going to pay almost all the customers back, everyone with deposits under some amount, a couple €100,000, right? I'm just going to pay them back immediately. That's going to be done. And so that's a big commitment on behalf of the government. It's actually central banks that do that, but we'll get to that. Okay? There's a big commitment that the government has made, and sort of in exchange for that, they want to say, well, if you're going to be part of this scheme, you need to behave in a prudent manner. Right? We can't just have you have 1% reserves. And then, the bank went under, the government has to bail us out. Sorry, right? We don't want that. We want you to behave in a prudent manner. So part of the deal with this is that in order to call yourself a bank, there's now a whole lot of regulations that you have to adhere to, right? Because the central bank is stepping in to bail you out if anything goes wrong. And when people see the name bank on a door of a place, they need to know that they got their stuff insured. They can't be fooled thinking they have insurance when they don't have insurance. So if you want to call yourself a bank, and if you want to take people's deposits, you have to behave in a certain way, and you're subject to all kinds of laws. Okay? And this is why I cannot nowadays legally set up the Bank of Ivan, because I don't have nearly the assets to make this happen. Right? We need to be backed by a certain amount of money so that I can ride out rough times. And there's a whole series of questions. And look into my background, and we don't want that. So a Bank of Ivan is out. But maybe you guys could start a bank, get some rich friends. Maybe you're rich yourself, you put together a bank. You have to adhere to all these laws. And the law that is going to be particularly important for us is that you have to keep a certain amount in reserve. There's lots of things that you have to adhere to, but you have to keep a certain amount of your deposits in reserve. This is called the required reserve ratio. Right? And so if you're running a bank and the required reserve ratio is 5%, which is the kind of number you should be thinking about, that the bank has to keep 5% in reserves, but you're really risky by nature, and you want to hold 3% in reserves, right? Because you want the extra profit, right? So your desired reserve ratio is 3%. The required reserve ratio is 5%. You got to go with 5%, right? Tough luck. You have to be more prudent than you want to be. If, on the other hand, you're a very conservative banker, and you say, no, 5% is ridiculous. What I want to do, I want to be really safe. I want to keep 10% in reserve. You can do that. You can keep more than the required reserve ratio in place, but you have to keep at least the required reserve ratio in place. So really the one that matters is whichever one is larger. Whichever one is larger is going to be the relevant reserve ratio that the bank has to do. By the way, there's lots of other laws as well that are important, particularly about where you loan this money out to, right? Because also we want you to get paid back from the loans that you loan out, right? So you take people's deposits, you keep a certain amount in reserves, and the rest you loan to somebody in some form or another. And there's all kinds of laws about how risky those loans can be, and various ways to measure that. So if you hear the Basel I and Basel II, Basel III, these are all different agreements about how we're going to measure the riskiness of the loans that the banks loan out. Okay? We're not going to worry about that here. We're going to say they loan it out and everything gets paid back nice and easy. But in real life, that's a big deal, right? And so what our central bank does mostly these days is, like the Irish central bank and all central banks everywhere, spend a lot of time regulating the banks and looking at their portfolios and how risky are these portfolios, how stable is the bank, how well backed up it is. But to see why they're doing that, we need to know why they care about banks in the first place. So to do that, suppose that I wanted to increase the money supply. So our basic premise is that a central bank is going to be an institution that's created, in our case, to change the money supply, to increase the amount of money that's out there or decrease the amount of money that's out there, or to just decide on how much money should be out there. Okay, that's their goal. And remember, money means bank account balances. Okay? They also have some printing of the money possibilities, but that's not really the issue. Really, the issue is how much is in the banking system. Right? And so because that's their job, and when we say money, we mean bank balances, all of a sudden they're very much involved in the banking sector, which is why central banks regulate the banking sector, because money and banking are the same thing, right? The way we've defined money. Okay, so I'm a central bank, and I decide that I want to get €1 out into the economy. So suppose, for simplicity, that I have the power to print out the money. So I print out a €1 coin, mint a coin, €1 coin. And now I have to get that coin into the economy. And so the way I'm going to do it, it's very clever, very sophisticated method. I'm going to go down to O'Connell Street. I'm just going to toss it down the street and watch them go up there. And it is now in the economy. Right? And €1 is in the economy now. So what happens? Well, first, somebody picks up this coin, Joe. Joe picks up the coin. The money supply is now €1 higher. Right? There's €1 more out there in the European money supply than there was before, because I tossed this coin hot off the press out into, burnt my fingers, out in there, and now Joe has the coin. Right? Simple, easy, no muss, no fuss. But it doesn't stop there, and that's the point of this slide. Joe is going to take that coin, and he's going to deposit some of it in the bank. This little CR is some fraction that gets lost behind his couch. Right? He just keeps in cash because he has drug deals to do later on. Some portion of it goes back into the money, goes back into the bank. Okay? And then the bank now has this amount in its bank vault, but it doesn't want that. It only wants a fraction of that. So let's suppose the required reserve ratio is the relevant one, RR. And so it's going to loan a fraction of that, say 95%, out to Carl. And so Carl now has cash. Yeah, how much cash? He has the €1 that got found, the amount that Joe put in the bank, times the amount that the bank loaned out. So this is going to be this fraction A of €1. Okay, I'm just going to work with A from now on. This fraction A of €1 that ends up being loaned back to Carl. And so now, what has happened to the money supply? Well, Joe has €1 that he doesn't have before. Not physically, it's in the bank. But remember, the bank balance is money, right? He can spend it. He can use his card. He can go paying. So it's money. Right? He has this bank balance. But also, Carl has this A amount of money, less than €1, but still some money that he has in actual cash. So now, I threw €1 into the economy, but the total amount that the money supply has gone up is more than the amount that I threw in, right? You can see this is another one of these multiplier things coming at us, right? It's exactly that kind of thing, because Carl now spends that and, well, or just directly deposit it in the bank, and the bank is going to get that money, A times A, right? The A that he has times the amount that ends up loaned out, which is another A, and that amount is going to get loaned to Sarah, right? So now we've got Joe, who has €1 in the bank. We have Carl, who has A euros in the bank, and we have Sarah, who has A times A euros in cash. And so on, and so on, and so forth. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, let me do it. So what happened? we had the total change in the money supply is equal to the 1 that Joe got plus A that Carl got plus A squared that Sarah got plus A cubed plus A to the 4th and so on and so forth. And each of these A's is fractions, right? It's the fraction that ends up deposited in the bank times the fraction that the bank loans out. So we know they're all fractions, right? And so I can, if I so desire, which I do, I can put parentheses around all of this. Haven't changed anything. I've just put parentheses around it. And then I can factor out A because each one of these things has an A multiplied by it. So change in M is equal to 1 plus A times 1 plus A squared plus A to the 3rd, where this one went here, that one went there, that one went there, that one went there, and so on. Right. But then we notice that this here looks exactly the same as this whole thing. Right? It's just 1 plus A squared plus so on and so forth. So we can substitute it in. Change in M is equal, not AM, change in M. Change in M is equal to 1 plus A times change in M. Because this blue stuff is the same as that blue stuff, which is the same as change in M. So I get change in M minus A change in M equals 1. Change in M, 1 minus A is equal to 1, just factoring out the change in M. And so change in M is equal to 1 over 1 minus A. And this is what's called the money multiplier. And what's going on here fundamentally is that many people kind of feel like they have a claim on this money, right? The claims on this €1 coin, Joe thinks he has all of it. Carl thinks he has a portion of it. Sarah thinks she has a portion of it, and so on and so forth, smaller and smaller portions. And in fact, they all do, right? Now, they can't all get it at the same time because the bank would collapse, right? It's only one physical euro, but they all have it in the bank and they feel like they can spend it whenever they want. And in fact, they can spend it whenever they want, as long as they don't all spend it all at once. Same way, we can all get our money out of AIB as long as we don't all go together and try to get our money out of AIB. Okay? Exactly the same thing. Not to pick on AIB. It's an ordinary bank, that's how banks work. Okay? And so if I want to, and what are we thinking this is? This is, I don't know, something like, A is something like 5%, so 0.05. So this is, I'm sorry, A is something like 95%, 0.95. So the denominator is something like 0.05. This is something like 20. Right? The money multiplier is in the range of 20. Meaning, if we put €1 physically into the economy, after this multiple rounds of putting the money in the bank loaning it out, those people putting it in the bank, those people loaning it out, and so on and so forth, we end up with the money supply going up by 20. Okay? Roughly speaking, vaguely speaking. Okay? Now, importantly, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but importantly, this doesn't all happen instantly, right? There was a process involved in that. This process was I threw the money out, bounced down the street, this guy had to pick it up. Eventually, he put it in his bank. Eventually, the bank loaned it to somebody. That person put it in the bank. Eventually, that bank loaned it to somebody else. So this could take a while to happen, right? Which means if we are a central banker and we have this job of tossing euros down O'Connell Street, it's going to take a while for the full effect of that to be seen, right? Even though we throw out a euro, yeah, money supply is going to go up by 20 euros, Eventually, right? But that eventually could take a while. All right. Now, if you look in the book, it's a slightly different money multiplier because in practice, central banks don't do it quite this way. They could do it this way, but it's not actually how they do it. We physically gave a coin to Joe. In fact, what central banks do is they put it directly in the banking system. They put it directly in Joe's bank account, right? And so it's going to be a slightly different multiplier, right? Because Joe didn't deposit all of his in the bank, but the same idea is there. And this one's easy to calculate. Okay. Right, so how are we doing? How are we doing? Okay, I'll give you a 15-minute break now. Here's a good time for it. And we'll talk about how central banks control the money supply in real life after the break. Is this one here. And the point of this question is like, how the heck you can answer it? You can't answer that because you don't have the graph, right? You need the graph in order to answer that. So what's on this is a fair question because it is exactly the sort of question you are expected to answer. Of course, with a graph, right? It's a question about the Keynesian model. And so what is it supposed to look like? We have, okay, we got the same one there. So we want this one to be maybe? No. Yeah, happy days, happy days. Okay. Occasionally things work. It's a shock, but occasionally they do. Okay, so what did this graph look like back in the day? So it had Y, planned aggregate expenditure. It had 45-degree line. And it had and there was a shift in this curve, right? It was so one of these curves was the original one, and then it shifted to something else. I don't know whether it was up or down. No clue there in the thing. So let's suppose it shifted down. And then it gave us some numbers. It gave us, in some form or other, how far down it shifted. So let's say this is 4,500, which means this is 4,500. I'm making up the numbers. I have no idea what they were there. And then this is 4,000, right? And then this number was something like 4,250. Okay. Now I just made up those numbers, but I made them up in a way that is consistent with B being the correct answer. Right? And so you could be given a graph like that and say, what is the multiplier? And well, we know how much the curve shifted. Right? This is like if we changed government spending, like if we reduced government spending by, in this case, 250. Right? So the whole curve shifted down by 250. We must have changed G by 250. So G went down by 250. And then output went down by 500. Right. We're given both those numbers. Obviously, we can't see them here. It would be totally different numbers, but twice as much as G went down by. Right, so we have the multiplier is change in Y over the change in G, which is change in Y is minus this multiplier. Is change in Y was minus 500 divided by minus 250. Minuses cancel and we just get 2. And that's what you were meant to do. The numbers could have been totally different. It could have been a shift up instead of a shift down, but that's what you're meant to do. And it's really a question that's getting at sort of two things. Do you know how to read the graphs? And do you know what the multiplier is? Calculations aren't difficult, but you do need to know those two things. You need to be able to read the graph, obviously not this one, but maybe that one. And knowing what the multiplier is. It's if you change exogenous spending by a certain amount, how many times that does output change by? Other exam questions? The whispering makes me feel like there's exam plots, schemes. Yes, thank you. Our heroine, the tax multiplier.
And what is it?
Okay, so yeah. So I wouldn't think about it as a formula, like as a thing to memorize. You could do, but it's pointless because multipliers, I can change the model, you get a different multiplier. But the idea there is, let's suppose I'm going to go, the government's going to go in debt by 100. Right? So there's two ways they could do that. They could spend more without changing taxes, or they could reduce taxes. So I could either spend 100 more, or I could reduce taxes by 100. And either one of those is going to expand the economy. Right? And let's suppose I reduce my taxes by 100. That means somebody's going to feel rich because they have 100 they didn't already have. They're going to feel rich. They're going to go out and buy something. That person's going to feel rich. They're going to go out and buy something, and so on and so on and so forth. Right? My other option is to buy something. Okay? After I've bought it, that person's going to feel rich. They're going to go out and buy something. Those people are going to feel rich. So after I bought it, it's exactly the same thing as happened with the taxes. Somebody feels rich, they go out and buy something, and so on and so forth. But there's this initial effect, which is I bought something. So that something got produced. So I'm going to have more effect on the economy by buying something than I am by reducing taxes. Because the rich feeling is the same either way, but initially I'm buying something when I buy something. And then the rich feeling kicks in. And so the government spending multiplier is always going to be bigger than the tax multiplier. I'm always going to get more effect on the economy by spending more than I am by reducing taxes. And that's the point of that. So that's fun. I've been teaching this for 30 years. That's the first time I did it from that direction, and it worked very well. I think it worked well. I think it was, yeah. Nice. You learn something new every day. Who knew? Other questions? You know, everyone's just saying, I hope someone asks a question. I am so confused. Please ask the question. Okay, so in honor of our exam on Monday, I hate it. You hate it more, I know, but I hate it as well. In honor of that, I'm not going to do any more class today. We'll go over, I guess, next Thursday by the time we get to how central banks actually operate. Next Tuesday, we'll be going over the exam. And so that if people have any objections or comments on what happened on the day, they have a chance to say those.